Great tits are known for one big thing. Their distinctive call. What do you think I was going to say? Their little teacher chime is synonymous with British gardens, but thanks to climate change, they are facing a big problem. And on this episode of the Oxford Sparks Big Questions podcast, we are looking at these teeny tiny little birds and we are asking, will climate change kill off the great tits? Hello, I'm Emily Elias, and this is the show where we seek out the brightest minds at the University of Oxford and we ask them the big questions. And on this episode, we are leaving the house. Yes, we are going into the wild, big, beautiful, open spaces of the Wytham Woods to meet, at a social distance, a researcher with birds on the brain.
So I am Charlotte Regan, and currently we are sat in a gloriously sunny Wytham Woods. And I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford looking at the great tit population in these beautiful woods.
If you are unfamiliar with great tits, let's just do a very quick introduction.
So they are our largest tit species in the UK, and they're about the same size as a robin. They weigh sort of anywhere between around 16 grams and 22 grams. So they weigh a little bit less than a AA battery. They are sort of yellow on their chest and belly, and then they have sort of a greenish back, blue-grey wings, and then this very obvious sort of like black cap on their head. And the males have a really big sort of thick black stripe down their chest.
What do they sound like?
So they do this very characteristic sound that you will have probably heard if you've been in any woodland, and we describe it as being sort of like a teacher song. So that's generally how we describe what their song sounds like. I believe it sounded a bit angrier.
Charlotte is lucky to have spent most of her lockdown in Wytham Woods on the outskirts of Oxford. Now, her job is very complicated, but one key task is to walk around the woods and check on the birds.
So we've been studying this population actually since the 1940s, but in a systematic way since 1961. And in any spring breeding season, we have between 200 and 500 breeding pairs. And one of the key parts of this population that we're studying is their responses to the gradual changes in temperature we're seeing with climate change.
So how bad is climate change for these birds? Like, what's happening to them?
So the main thing that we see is these birds, they really rely on a specific peak in caterpillar abundance to feed their chicks. And as springs are warming and becoming earlier, these caterpillars are advancing when they emerge. And so to keep track of this, the birds are also having to advance when they're laying their eggs, and therefore when their eggs are hatching and the chicks are needing maximum food. So that's the main change that we're seeing and that we're studying very closely.
So just a small little thing like an early spring is having a really big effect on these guys.
Yeah, so although to us it might seem, every year we don't really notice that much of a difference, but over the last 60 years we've seen a really dramatic change in temperature, and even in this study. And so we've seen the birds advancing their laying date by around 2 weeks over that time. And the problem is that if they cannot keep up, their chicks, if they're not provided with enough caterpillars, which is the main thing that the parents use to feed their chicks during that time, they just won't survive to be adults. And given that each adult generally on average only survives 2 years, you can see that even sort of one breeding season without having any chicks fledge from nests can really have a dramatic effect on that population size and how well it can cope over the next breeding season.
Does it just come down to temperatures? Are there other things that are making problems for the great tits?
One thing that we're looking at over and above sort of the changes in average temperature that we're seeing with climate change is we know that with climate change we're also seeing sort of increased variability. So we're seeing that consecutive years are actually sort of more different now than they were sort of in the beginning of this study, so back in the 60s. We're also seeing changes in the frequency of like super hot days and super cold days, which over and above changes in average temperature can have quite dramatic effects on species such as this, which don't live very long and sort of raise their offspring over a relatively short amount of time.
Charlotte and her team at the Woods are tracking hundreds of birds. And it's the kind of territory where there are just too many to have adorable, cutesy little names worked out for each one.
I'd say the main thing is as you go around, you really notice like the different personalities in the parents for sure. You know, some of them you visit the nest box and they either just sort of fly out while you kind of do your things of weighing the eggs. But some are much more defensive and they'll really try to kind of scare you off their nest. So that's almost the ones that I remember is I know the boxes where the parent has a really like bold personality. This one's empty, but we can keep looking at.
And on her regular trips, she has a little routine. She goes out and she finds these little gray concrete tube-like boxes that all have numbers on them. They're little bird houses, and she slides them open and she takes a peek inside.
We had that really sort of warm period in February, March, and we sort of expected that we might have quite an early breeding season, and then everything cooled down. So we have birds at the moment making nests. So a lot of our boxes now have sort of early nests in, and then we have some that have just started laying.
And when she takes the cover off, she can tell things like, is there a nest inside? What is that nest made of? Are there any eggs? And she takes all of this and she logs it in her notebook.
They generally lay one egg per day once they've started laying, but we do often see that if there's a very cold spell, they'll just skip laying on one day or two. So the birds can sort of make a few adjustments to try to change their sort of luck in terms of the environment they're going to experience when they raise their chicks.
And how many eggs will they lay in one season?
Yeah, so for our great tits, normally we see sort of around 8 or 9 eggs laid, whereas blue tits lay a lot more. So sometimes we see 14 eggs in a blue tit nest.
What happens if we lose all our great tits?
I think the main thing for me is that firstly, they're a super sort of informative species. They're one of the most well-studied birds in the world, and they've provided so many useful insights into sort of ecology and evolution that we would sort of lose if we couldn't study them anymore. But more than that as well is that, you know, I have a feeder in my garden. I enjoy watching them come to the feeders, and they're one of our sort of most loved birds in the UK and in Europe. So that would be a real loss, I think, even if you were to lose just one local population, that would be a real loss. But also losing them could have quite dramatic consequences for like other species that live in the woodlands. So we know that sparrowhawks here rely on sort of great tit chicks to feed their offspring and to stay alive. So you can imagine that there might be these like ramifications like through the food chain onto other species that you know we also enjoy watching and you know we also enjoy studying too.
Could they also just like, I don't know, take a chance and be like, hey, we're leaving the UK. We're going to go find somewhere else that has better caterpillars for us to eat when we want to eat them?
Yeah, so I think the main thing that I could see happening, as we see with many of these species, is that they would probably shift northwards. So to the extent that they can do so, obviously, if you move north, temperatures are cooler, you stand a better chance of keeping track of these climate changes. So I think I could just imagine people noticing these obvious changes in the like composition of different species and birds, you know, at their feeding stations and nesting in their nest boxes. And I think having had these birds around for so long, that would be a real shame.
Is there a risk that they could disappear?
So I think there's definitely a possibility that if climate change continues, our springs continue to get warmer and continue to get earlier, the caterpillars are probably going to be better able to continue to advance. And this could lead to the great tits being essentially finding it impossible to keep track of this resource, which means they're not going to have enough food for their chicks, which could eventually, if everything continues as we're seeing at the moment, lead to particularly like local extinctions of great tit populations for sure.
And you said that these birds live for an average of 2 years. So what's the timeline on seeing them disappear? Are we actually talking about a few years?
In our population, it's perhaps unlikely to happen over that short a timescale, but I think if everything continues as it does right now, perhaps in the next few decades, we could start seeing sort of more dramatic reductions in in the output of parents in this population. There are other populations which are already seeing much more of a mismatch than we are, and so they might see more dramatic changes before we do and act as kind of a little bit of a warning system for us.
What can we do to help them?
There are many things we can do, like from larger scale changes through to small ones. So I would say the main thing, as we're talking about the effects of climate change on this species, is maybe to also think about what we as individuals can do to sort of try to reduce our impacts on carbon emissions. So things like, trying to walk and cycle where we can, use public transport, sort of reducing meat and dairy consumption, and also lobbying our governments and institutions just to sort of make the bigger changes that we as individuals can't. But even over and above that, there are things that we can do. For example, providing these birds food over the winter. They will use feeders readily, and that may help them to maintain the condition they need to go into breeding in a position where they can modify their behavior, as well as sort of like really sort of visiting our woodlands and sort of ensuring that they are kept for these populations in the long term.
And the hope is that we will keep our great tits great. This podcast was brought to you by Oxford Sparks from the University of Oxford, with music by John Lyons, and a special thanks to our guide, Dr. Charlotte Regan. Rate and review this podcast, or better yet, just go tell a friend. Yeah, we'll settle for telling a friend. We like that sort of thing. You can find us on the internet. We are at Oxford Sparks, and we've got a neato website. Kids still say neato, right? Okay, it's oxfordsparks.ox.ac.uk. I'm Emily Elias. Bye for now.